Hello, I'm Valora Washington. I'm so happy to welcome you to join us today. I'm CEO of the CAYL Institute, that's Community Advocates for Young Learners. And it's my honor to welcome you today to this webinar series. Our goal is to bring you timely, relevant, and actionable topics of interest about young children and the people who work with them. We're CAYL, that's Community Advocates for Young Learners. And on the call today are many community leaders and people we've worked with over the years. We were established in 2003, and we welcome you to join us. On today's CAYL webinar series, we offer you both an invitation and a challenge. We know this invitation and challenge is important because, especially now, it's critical for us to understand the importance of thinking simultaneously about the field's present, as well as our aspirations for the future. Now is the time that we have to engage with each other in order to advance our collective thinking about the quality of life for our children and their families. This is also an opportunity for us to advance early childhood education as a field of practice. As many education leaders discuss the transformation of early childhood education, many questions emerge about the role of higher education in this transformation. What's the relationship between teaching effectiveness and degree attainment? How can higher education be more supportive of practitioners? How are the ways that race and culture, different abilities, diversity, how can all of these things be strengthened in higher education? How can higher education better accommodate linguistically diverse and immigrant populations? This afternoon, we're going to discuss these questions and more. Leading the discussion are three experts that I am happy to present to you. Our keynote speaker is Camille Catlett, and she's the Senior Technical Assistant Specialist at the Frank Porter Graham Child Development Institute at the University of North Carolina. And joining her is Zeynep Isik-Ercan, who's a professor of early childhood education and co-director of the Early Childhood Leadership Institute at the Rowan University School of Education. Our third presenter is Pam Perrino, an early childhood advocate and educational consultant in Ohio. This webinar is brief, it's only an hour. So we invite you to bring your questions and comments to the chat and the Q&A session throughout the webinar. And in response to popular demand, at the end of the webinar, we're going to put in the chat a link that you can join us in a Q&A session to continue the dialogue with our presenters. As we're having our conversation today, one of the things that we know for sure is, like teachers and the programs that serve them, early childhood higher education programs are facing adaptive pressures and dynamics for which they might not be fully prepared. Advocacy is growing very strong for lead teachers in early childhood programs to have a bachelor's degree, but many colleges, schools, departments of education find that they don't have the capacity to meet this growing demand, or that they themselves are understaffed or under-resourced. So the paradox is really clear. Public awareness about the importance of the early years is growing very fast. And we know that it takes a lot of expertise to be an effective teacher of young children. Yet on the other hand, as more people enroll in college courses, there are still questions about what they should know and be able to do. And with these degrees, how can they be better compensated and better respected? In previous work that I co-authored with 8 national organizations, we talked about these as questions of the role, relevance, and experience of higher education institutions to reinvent themselves. Role means, how are these college credentials going to be a qualifying element for workforce participation? And is everybody in agreement with that? Relevance is, we're asking, is this higher education really preparing people to work with the children of the 21st century? And what about the capacity of higher education to reinvent itself in view of our current needs? But notwithstanding all of this, many organizations and states are definitely putting forth the vision that eventually all lead teachers must have a bachelor's degree. And this is based on solid evidence that's outlined in the 2015 National Academies report called Transforming the Workforce for Children from Birth to Age 8, really recognizing that in order to realize the opportunities of early childhood education, the teacher needs to be deeply grounded in the science of early learning and also have a strong post-secondary general education. So will and how are institutions of higher education going to face these adaptive challenges for teachers of young children? The reality is states are still wanting people to have a bachelor's degree in many cases, especially in state-funded programs, even as there are post-pandemic staffing shortages all across the United States. What is early childhood education, higher education, going to do to meet this vision? The Early Childhood Workforce Index tells us that people with a bachelor's degree in our field make a lot less money than people with other bachelor's degrees, and this can be up to $45,000 less a year. But there are benefits to having that degree, especially if you plan on staying in our field, because we know that preschool and kindergarten teachers with a bachelor's degree make $5 to $8 more an hour than other people, and this can add up to over $500,000 over the course of their careers. Models to help degreed people grapple with issues of access, affordability, and quality are definitely out there. And there are very many promising practices, and many of which you will hear about today. There will be a follow-up email to this webinar today, and we will provide you with a lot of resources about these issues of early childhood teacher education and models that work. So first of all, let's get started hearing from our experts to tell us whether early childhood higher education is ready or not. We are going to answer questions such as looking at the increasing number of staff with degrees, the fact that the compensation isn't reflecting education, the current staffing crisis. We're going to start with Camille Catlett, who's going to speak with us, following by Zeynep, and then followed by Pam Perrino. What's the future of early childhood higher education? Let's hear from our experts. Camille, what do you think?
Well, I think our entire understanding of these issues has changed significantly in the last 6 years. And as you mentioned, transforming the workforce really helped to identify the fact that we don't have a professional system. We have bits and pieces and parts at the local, regional, state, and national level. And that makes it more difficult to really undertake the commitment to preparing professionals who are confident, comfortable, and capable to support each and every child and family. There's also been tremendous change in the last several years with regard to some of the documents and the frameworks that guide our work, speaking specifically to the NAEY's position on equity and other things. But to get ready, I think there are several things that we really need to think about. And one of those is the explicit and intentional preparation of adult learners. And I use those words very, very intentionally. I kind of feel as I got a dress rehearsal for the chance to visit with you today when I spent the day with a department at a university here in Southern California, which is why you see the backdrop you do. And it was an amazing day because they've come together to really discuss how to move forward in their shared commitment to more explicitly and intentionally reflecting in their coursework, in their field experiences, in their program practices, their commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And starting at this point, I just want to acknowledge I created a handout for some of the things that I'm going to be mentioning. So along with the materials that Valora mentioned, you'll be getting a handout that will give you specific access to some of the resources and tools that I will be talking about. But what I got to see yesterday when I visited with this program as a resource was an extraordinary leader, their department chair, who has a vision and a commitment to their program, really supporting each and every child and family and preparing diverse and well-qualified professionals to do that. I also saw that they have institutional support for spending time on explicit and intentional enhancements to their program. And finally, I saw the individual commitment and enthusiasm from these faculty members. And I guess that's my vision of what I would like to see in the field. But part of what we know is that that's not exactly what we can rely on seeing in every program quite yet. Expectations of faculty members have grown considerably. It once used to be considered de rigueur if a single article on diversity that might talk about international child rearing practices was included in a course as a way of saying, yes, we were being responsive to different positions, to different views. But I think now as we think about those who prepare the future workforce, and I'm using that language very intentionally because I think that's the conglomeration of faculty members and coaches and mentors and supervisors and cooperating teachers who together contribute to what each educator knows and is able to do and how they put together each child's context, each child's individuality, each family, each community, and their knowledge of development and learning to make wise decisions. And what you've just heard me define in a way is the new position on developmentally appropriate practice. So some of the things that this means need to be incorporated into higher education programs is far more emphasis on knowledge acquisition, certainly, but knowledge application. How is it that we are providing opportunities for safe practice? For students who are English language learners, how are we giving them opportunities as adult learners to practice the conversations that they will ultimately be having in their second language with children and with families? How do we get away from quizzes and move instead to other mechanisms and other vehicles that really provide a chance to apply, to individualize, and to practice? The great news is that there are far more resources to do this than we've ever had before. And there are also models. The model that I was sharing with my colleagues yesterday is a model called the Blueprint model that very clearly has developed a process that has evidence-based results for changing what's in a course, for changing how assignments align with outcomes, and both outcomes for the course and outcomes for students. I think the other thing that we're also really looking at is how to take those same principles of universal design for learning that we are asking educators to apply to students and applying those to adults. And how are we really taking that into account as we individualize for adult learners? How do we really also, as part of that, work to recruit adult future educators who reflect the diversity of the children and families they'll be serving? And I think this is dramatically underscored in the new equity statement, but it says to us that we need to begin earlier. We need to incorporate the funds of knowledge that each learner is bringing and to make this discipline and the unique vocabulary of our field also more meaningful and more explicit to them. Once again, universal design is part from that. And I think one of the interesting distinctions that we've been making for quite a while is that some students are traditional and some are non-traditional. And I rarely hear the term non-traditional students used in a flattering or complimentary way. And I wonder at what point we stop making that distinction and instead just embrace the idea that learners come with different capabilities, ages, insights, and attitudes, and that we really need to apply that notion of how do we support and build the success of each and every one of our students. There are great models that are being proven to be incredibly effective as we look at models that can help students stay in their position and continue to complete their education, like apprenticeship, as we look at opportunities to eliminate barriers through credit for prior learning, through articulation agreements. Those are all really promising practices. I think Valora also mentioned that the elephant in the room, the thing that we are hoping Power to the Profession will help us to really figure out is compensation, because part of what we know is wise families are not going to encourage their children to pursue a career and enter a field in which they will always need to work a second job if they want to own a house. So I'm naive and optimistic enough to believe that we have good models, we have good people, we have good energy, we don't have our commitments in ways that will really institutionalize and move forward these practices. But I have hope. I look at projects like the Michigan Persona Project, where 8 teams across the state are working together, teams of faculty and family members and professional development providers and state agency folks. They're growing stories about the real children with challenging lives in Michigan to use as instructional resources. So when students who are going to Mott Community College in Flint, Michigan, are figuring out how to support each and every child, the stories that they are using to help them figure that out come from children who have lived through the water crisis. I'm thinking about developments like Pennsylvania's decision to use the professional standards and competencies for early childhood educators, both at the higher ed level and at the ongoing professional development level, so that for the first time, there's that synchrony across what it is that those of us who work in this field need to know and be able to do. One of the things that holds as a possibility is, might it be that faculty members, the single most important group to not be a target for state level professional development, would actually have resources to support them in doing the kinds of new things that we are hoping they will. I also am excited by programs like the University of Montana Western seeking foundation funding to support a curricular redesign process. And then I also have to say that individual faculty who have taken to heart the guidance about how important it is that each and every child is who we're targeting with their family to support with the students who come through our programs, who are attending the free Script NC webinars and learning about new tools and learning about new resources and making the commitment to their ongoing professional development. I have to herald how much of a joy it is to see their names in the box, just like I'm seeing yours, committing to individually really achieving this vision that I have and that I believe our professional organizations have and children and families have. So that's what I have to say about the future. How about you, Zeynep?
So it's so hard to follow Camille after this wonderful introduction. You just really nailed a lot of the issues for us. So welcome everyone. It's so good to be here. I'm so happy that I'm here with Pam, Camille, and of course, Valora. So good to see you all. I just wanted to add, build on actually what Camille said in terms of how to prepare teachers who are doing their best job while also supporting them the best. So I wanted to give you, as wearing my hat of a teacher educator, also researcher who does research on early childhood education, and also work with state and nonprofit and other organizations to work with our in-service workforce, right? So I would like to give you a little bit historical background on how our field has grown. So there are a couple of parallel movements when we think about early childhood teacher education. We had a field that is called teacher education in the past. Actually, my own university, Rowan University, started as a teacher's college. It was Glassboro State College. The first program that ever created was a teacher's education program in my university. So teacher education has been a practical tradition, but we have not really considered so much of this research aspect, studying teacher education to see what works well, except the last 50 years or so, we have been doing a much better job of that. So any teacher educator that comes to your higher education institution has also to be, for the most part, a good researcher. Researcher not in the sense that they have to publish a lot, but researcher in the sense that they have to know what's happening, the scoop in the field. So I think that field has grown a lot to say what works well to us in general, and not only just early childhood teacher education, but for at each level. Another thing that has grown so far has been the competition, and I think the choices that our audiences, teacher candidates and our workforce who have been in the childcare field have. higher education in general has had to revitalize themselves to come up with more of an innovative programs and programs that actually addresses the needs of the workforce instead of forcing them to follow a particular, curriculum model that they demanded because they just created that. So I feel like higher education, and the data shows us higher education in general have been more agile and flexible to meet the demands. And we can see that in the numbers too. The numbers have increased almost 50% in terms of what choices the teacher education programs have across the nation in the last 20 years. Now we have many more program options. So a couple things that we are practically doing at the higher education institutions as early childhood teacher educators now is renewing our syllabus every couple years, because we would like to keep it up to date, but also there is a very high stringent, very high strict accreditation requirement that is with CAPE, which used to be ANCATE, our accreditation body, and some universities have also additional accreditation bodies that they need to meet. So the quality improvement and measuring quality has been a great focus with what we know, what works in teacher education. So every teacher education program, including the early childhood teacher education programs, now have to be data-based. So with every program and faculty meeting we actually review data to see where our students are, finding their spaces, where are they achieving, where are they struggling. So really, it has been more of a student-centered and data-centered overall, and I think there are, I would say, there are other pieces where when you do them well, the field of early childhood teacher education gets strengthened as a whole. So I'm going to go over a couple of these pieces. So the one thing that I wanted to talk about is the institutional commitment, that an institution and a university has to be committed to meeting as a whole, not just one program, but as a university meeting the needs of where the workforce are, by taking them where they are. So the early childhood teacher education programs and professional development programs that universities offer must be robust and flexible. They must offer these kinds of designs that take into consideration and integrates prior training, professional development, CDAs, and courses. So in a way, it needs to offer tailored programs. For instance, programs focused on infant and toddler education, birth to 5 only, and they need to focus on eliminating barriers. Now, I'll tell you that in the past, the funding for any kind of renovation, innovation in a teacher ed program was not there, especially for early childhood level. However, right now, I think there's an opportunity where institutions and early childhood programs have been active players, not only in designing programs, but also being players in how overall state systems and functions work and what is needed for a particular state level. So we need to really do these well. One example that I can give you, sort of like tooting our own horn, but at Rowan we have the Early Childhood Leadership Institute, and any kind of training, we are part of the QRIS, Quality Rating and Improvement System with the New Jersey State. Any kind of training that we provide, at some point when you build enough hours, it actually helps you waive a course as a graduate course. You actually waive a course moving into your graduate certificate program, which is focused on early childhood leadership. So in a way, every program that you create actually helps you and not become a barrier where now you have to start all over again. So I think these kinds of tailored programs really eliminates barriers for folks. Definitely, I'm not going to even go over the compensation issue that Camille really elaborately talked about. I feel like the second piece we need to do well, and if it is done well, it is really a big impact, is the cross-system collaboration. We are really at a point where we cannot function in silos anymore. So any early childhood teacher educator has to be, and we are for the most part, very connected to what's happening at the state level, what's happening at the nonprofits, with businesses, can be create partnership with businesses? Can we have residency programs where we can offer the cohort models? And definitely having mentorship programs. And can we have funding for these folks who are already maybe in the field? One example from Rowan is that we have the impact program recruiting Black males into teaching profession, not just for early childhood, but my colleagues at Rowan has started this program. The ideas like professional development schools, again, cohort models, residency models are important. In Camden, New Jersey, we are, again, Rowan Education College partners or faculty members, my colleagues have agreements with Camden, where any student that we place in Camden, and there's another district, Collingswood, I believe, that they actually become a teacher's aide in the classroom. So that way they're getting the compensation. So these programs are really important to continue. There are other innovative approaches for program design, so many of them really. I want to throw a couple examples from our recent National Association of Early Childhood Teacher Educator conference that my colleagues have actually presented on the national level in terms of what they are doing. They're all wonderful programs. Again, our issue is that how do we make them large scale? How do we get funding? How do we get institutional commitment that you can actually replicate something that works really well? For instance, colleagues in Western Washington University incorporated Black Lives Matter movement in early childhood teacher education programs. Colleagues of in University of North Carolina, Karen Lepar and colleagues that are working on analyzing a national survey of all teacher educator, early childhood teacher educator programs to see what works well. There are a lot of movements in terms of practitioner inquiry, learning from the practical knowledge that teachers bring to us. Play-based pedagogy. So there is a presentation again in our last conference about how do we bring play-based pedagogies in andragogy in adult learning into early childhood teacher education. We're teaching them how to play with children and how to teach children to play at higher levels. How about adult learners, right? And other colleagues at Texas A&M University of Delaware Lab School adapted their coaching and mentoring programs for new teachers during COVID time. And there are other models where during COVID time, technology was incorporated well. And I think, I want to just end this. I think I'm over my time. I want to end this by saying that we can dream big for future, even though, for instance, we don't see infant and toddler education at PhD levels. I believe we will get to that point. So we should not be shy in imagining what specialized fields within subfields like infant and toddler education, like leadership, STEM education, do language learners look like at even higher level at the career ladder, at each level. And I want to end this by, again, reiterating that collaboration with our community college partners that is extremely important. They bring a wealth, and our students should not repeat what they have already learned when they move into a bachelor. So better articulation, and then also really watching what's happening at the national level is important, like Macy's Power to Profession movement is important to be part of. So my message is let's work together to get this push now that the focus is on young children. And now I'm going to introduce Pam, who is the practitioner and a consultant. Pam, please take the stage.
Thank you so much. And I so appreciate being here today. I'm going to speak to you probably more from, I guess, the consumer end. I do work as an adjunct professor at the University of Dayton, but I spend a lot of time in programs working at the community level, working on professional development and being in those classrooms and seeing what's happening. So I took the time to reach out to some of my colleagues at the state level that are involved in the quality rating and improvement system, and to a lot lot of my colleagues that are running larger programs. And I said, and I posed these questions to them, if you could ask higher ed to make adaptations so that your students would have more relevance coming out of their programs, what would it be that you would wish for? So the first bucket I'm going to talk to you a little bit about is within policies. Some of the things I heard from these programs and I see on a daily basis is the need for reflection on policies. I understand sometimes why they're set from the university perspective. One example is I'm not allowed to student teach in the program in which I work. I need to work full time in order to afford my college education. So now I have to take time off for the semester for my student teaching, but I'm not going to get any pay. So how am I going to afford to pay for school? When you think about this a little bit, let's look at nurses and doctors for a minute. Nurses go to school, they learn about theory, and then they're given clinical to practice their theory into practice. So they may be going to school for 2 days a week in classroom, and then may have a few hours a day where they do their clinical to apply that theory. So there isn't as much of a theory and practice gap. And then they also have time to work in other programs during this time. Doctors go to school and they focus primarily on theory, and then they do their residency, but they're not expected to do an internship during their final residency period without pay. Again, the pay might not be what it would be if they were fully licensed at that point, but they're paid to be out practicing their skill when they're being counted in the numbers and being used to take care of the patient load. You know, we need to maybe rethink the way we do internships so that it works for those that are going to school and perhaps for the programs that are employing them at the time so that it works to meet both needs. Let's think a little bit too about when we place students for student teacher placements or we place them for field experience. We often look for degreed teachers, but are placing them in a degreed teacher or in a certain level program enough? Do we really need to ensure that those teachers that they're being placed with have enough coaching and mentoring skills, and that they have the same philosophy around working and differentiating for adult learners? Let's think about our articulation agreements. You know, I see a lot of students that get their CDA because it's the first best step. And then they're planning on doing stackables among working to their associate degree and their four-year degree. But the problem is when they get their CDA, they're still required to take those introductory child development courses that they've already spent the last 9 months studying within their community-based trainings. So we have to really ensure that there are firm CDA articulation agreements within our community college, but within our four-year colleges as well. I heard directors tell me, I don't mind letting off Pam 2 days a week early or 3 days a week early to go start her four-year degree. But here's my problem. We have a state quality rating and improvement system. And by those policies and laws, Pam is expected to have so many hours of professional development where she needs to get her CDA. So I'm releasing her to start her college courses. But within taking her first 2 courses in early childhood at the college level, they don't articulate to anything in the quality rating and improvement system because they don't articulate to a CDA. Now let's talk about theory when we're talking about child development. I find it so hard to believe that those theory courses don't align, or we haven't taken the time to align them to the core components of the CDA so that it's a win-win for the college student and a win-win for the center director who wants to give release time. So now that employee meets the requirements for hours and points within that rating system so that they can pull down money to remain open. Are we connected enough as a profession to how the parts and pieces work? I was working on some state writing teams on the Ohio's early learning and developmental standards. And I took the initiative to take Northeast Ohio and try to take those to meet with the college professors to give those documents and talked about how they would embed those into their teacher prep programs. I can tell you out of all the colleges that I visited and universities, not one embedded those early learning and developmental standards into their programs within a 4 or 5 year period of time. because it didn't come down through the Department of Ed. It wasn't until it was embraced by the Department of Ed that it was embraced by higher ed. Yet, the majority of students coming out of those local universities and colleges were beginning their professions in community-based programs where that was a factor. So I'm sometimes concerned that our colleges and universities are not aware of the nuances within the quality rating and improvement system, as well as the requirements for the Department of Ed. Some states, they're together in the same department, lucky you, but in some states they're not. So I think we need to understand each other's language. One small piece that talking to these directors and the state quality rating and improvement system, our state system requires that if you're taking a college course, you need to upload it at the end of the semester, an official transcript. For many of these students who are working and living in poverty, they now have to pay an additional fee to upload that course. And of course, those fees aren't covered under their student loans or their financial support. So a mere policy of universities embedding that cost for a transcript once a semester for those early childhood majors would make it feasible for them to be able to upload that transcript so that it would count credit-wise as they're working on those stackable degrees. We as early childhood and at the college level need to have a voice at the Board of Regents. Like in our state, it's the organization that sets policy for the colleges. And yet there's very rarely anybody ever with an early childhood background. What's happened in Ohio is we've taken it and we've changed our licensure and we've made it pre-K to 3 instead of birth to age 8. And then what happened with that is we had to eliminate 2 classes out of the Common Core piece that every university had to have. And guess what the 2 courses were? They were in the information about infants and toddlers. And yet we know we need to differentiate our instruction. And oftentimes we have preschool and kindergarten children that are functioning cognitively at a 2-year-old level, but we're not learning that. In fact, in Ohio, we're doing away with our bands and our early learning and developmental standards. There's conversation to move it to a continuum, but the continuum for the early part may not be covered in our pre-K through 3rd grade licensure. Many colleges who focus on just that are missing a point of where we need to have knowledge base for birth through age 5 in our community-based programs. Yet the argument is they're not keeping that because you can't make a living wage. And my colleagues were so kind to point out that is part of the problem. In addition to that, I want to talk a little bit about the relationships and the effectiveness of degree attainment. So one question I want to pose to you as an adjunct professor, I take the time every semester to either have a Zoom chat or a telephone chat with every single student and every single one of my courses before the beginning of the semester. Yes, that's time consuming. Yes, that can be difficult. Do you know why I do that? Because our theory and practice is always about differentiating for children. So if I don't differentiate for the students that I am leading in my courses, how can I know what's happening in their personal lives, their work lives? So when I put an assignment up, and I primarily teach online. So when I teach online, if I don't know the work experience that you have, or I don't know the environment in which you're teaching, how can I differentiate that particular assignment to make it more meaningful to you so that you can actually apply theory into practice? Because we know in our profession, there is a large gap between the theory and the application. And I think sometimes we struggle. I look at some of my friends and colleagues that have been within higher ed for many years, and they do that full time. Sometimes what happens is they lose sight. They might be in the lab schools at their university, which are great. And we need those so that we can have close the gap between theory and practice. But the problem sometimes there is we don't have realistic ratios. It's not what our students are going to experience when they get out into a classroom where it's running state ratios. So one of the things I would love to see, and I heard this from many in the field that they shared, is wouldn't it be great when one of our college professors is on a sabbatical, that part of that sabbatical time, they're actually spending in a community-based program where they're not being an extra in the classroom, but counting in ratios so that they could better prepare students for what they're to face. Because what if I was in a classroom 5 years ago, it's a very different place than today than 5 years ago or 10 years ago even. It might take more time, but it might better prepare our students. One thing I also would like to share is the thought process that, bubble tests are really easy. They're super easy to grade, but oftentimes don't capture the student that may be the next rising professional because they're not good at memorizing the theory, but boy, can they apply it. So I know as an adjunct, I tend to focus primarily on projects. And how would you use this in your practice? Can you give me an example? Can you put together a plan or show me with other children in your neighborhood to how you would implement this plan? It takes more time, but I think it's a better assessment of our students' knowledge. We tell our students all the time that a standardized test is not the best way to evaluate young children, but yet the first thing we do as college professors is give a standardized test. So if we truly want to embrace for our students differentiation, then we need to practice it and model it in the way we teach our coursework. I did mention the theory gap. It is kind of a large piece that we need to work on. So again, when we think about those field experiences, are we ensuring that there's a community-based experience? Is there a public preschool experience? Is there a Head Start experience? Because those programs are all very different in nature. And it helps our students understand where they may want to set their goals and destination to. I had mentioned about the loss of lab schools, and that is really sad. So as we're thinking about budgets and we're thinking about what to advocate for in our programs, I would suggest that you really stress how to make sure that your students have hands-on experiences. I know I've kind of gone through quickly, but I wanted to share all the wonderful points that had been shared with me to share with you. So I'm going to get ready to ask the wonderful colleagues to come back so that we can have the panel here. And thank you so much.
Wow. This has been really exciting. My head is just bubbling with lots of questions and ideas. And, Zeynep told us not to be shy. And Camille told us that we need more synchrony among what we're doing. And Pam is pointing out that there's this gap between theory and practice. Come on, guys, how are we going to not be shy and deal with these disconnects, really make it work for teachers and practitioners? Any ideas?
Actually, one of the things that's happening that's exciting, and part of this is addressed in the resources that I'll share, is I'm seeing more and more collaboration between field experiences and courses in which, if, for example, there are aspects of individualizing environments that are being addressed in a course, that there would be communication with the cooperating teachers to say, here are the articles we're using, and how can you reinforce what they're learning in what they're seeing? And how can you prompt students to say, what did you notice about the last small group activity I led? What did you notice about how I individualized? So that there really is a chance to move from, I think, Pam pointed out the gap. The other thing that we need to really bridge that gap is opportunities for safe practice. And I think in some of the states that I'm working with different colleges and universities in right now, students will not have an opportunity, some of this has to do with the pandemic, to work with a family until they leave the program and enter the field. And that's unacceptable. So I think what we need instead, right now in Pennsylvania, there's a leadership effort going on where the state has put together some money to recruit families and to prepare them and to prepare educators to really build connections where students will have access to the families that are not available in some of the programs because they are not open as a result of the pandemic. So I think we're looking for chances to practice building that repertoire that students need based on having, tried out a difficult conversation before the first time they have it is in a situation where they're actually torturing a family.
Other ideas?
I can add to that too. I think I talked a little bit about the background of where teacher education has been going, and for the last 20 years or so, there has been a big push in clinical based practices. We even call right now, we are not allowed to call in the spirit of professionalizing our field. We're not even allowed to call our field experiences anymore. We have to call them clinical practices. And we have to call our student teachers not a student teacher anymore. We have to call them teacher candidates. Those are the sort of like demands that are also coming from our accreditators. So you'll see that a person who's graduating from any teacher education program will have completed close to 1,000 hours because of that. But here's the challenge with that. So when you increase the number of hours that are clinical hours in each course, what happens is your working professionals struggle a lot, especially because they're daytime hours. I would say that I think the policies at the state level should be flexed, especially for our workforce, because what if like weekend hours, what if we include evening hours, right? Like, so different family childcare hours, programs that are smart, and they also have permission from the state to do that. They also incorporate a variety of programs. I think Pam's point is on target in terms of how to diversify the settings also, right? Like, so we need to have urban settings, suburban settings, but also multi-age settings as well. Sadly, a lot of our teaching workforce has also feel like they have to, at some point, they have to move into a public school type of certificate, which is something that we resist as early childhood educators. I know in Indiana, my colleague Terry Swim, who has put forward a fight before when I was hired there, even to work with state to create birth to 5 certification, because in a lot of the states right now we're still operating with the P through 3, and some states do a birth through 8, which, as you know, we're preaching to choir. It's so hard to cover 3 fields in one particular teacher ed program. So I think definitely we need to move into convincing our policymakers that those areas are so different and specialized and equally important, right? Like, so infant and toddler education is equally important as P3 education. And that again goes back to the compensation question. So there's tangled issues, but I think we need to push. This is the time, especially at the policy level.
I'd like to add, I love what you're saying because it pushes back to my comment about a paid residency. So we're in short demand in our profession right now. And if we would have those first couple courses articulate to a CDA, in most states, as part of their clinical work, could be a paid residency. Therefore, it keeps people in the field. It allows them to have an income. It gives them practical hands-on experience. I think we need to rethink our concept around student teaching. I'm not sure that it is as doable in today's world or in this current time. There are very few professions that when you come out, that you're doing an internship without some type of stipend or financial support at the end of that. And yet I don't see that happening in education.
There are so many questions that have been raised in the chat, and I want to remind everybody that immediately following this session that ends at 5 o'clock, you will have a link which is in the chat, and the link will take you right to an opportunity that you can interact and ask questions of our panelists. So I want you to look for that and join us. There's so many questions that can be raised. I want to raise one question, and that is the issue that was brought up about the many options, or the term that Zeynep used, competition in higher education right now. I think this is a critical issue that has to be discussed, and I'd love to hear our panelists' thoughts about that. There is more. I agree with you, Zeynep. Is it better? Is that helping to professionalize us? What's the impact of this increase that we're seeing in the options?
And why don't you start?
I think any type of, I think there are certain, fortunately, right, we're at that point with our accreditation system. And overall, what we know, what works in teacher education programs, that what works is high quality programs that are agile and flexible and robust to meet people where they are. At the same time, they're heavily clinical, so that allows the experience in field in practice, and they could be differentiated for people's needs. I don't want to speak to, I cannot speak to each and every type of program and where they are, but all I can say is, I think if they're covered by accreditation in a college of education, that have the CAPE stamp and NAACT and CAPE stamp, we go through that process. That process takes about 2 years, and believe me, they are pretty stringent with their quality of teacher preparation. That's their job, to evaluate the quality for. So I think if I would say any audience that are following us, make sure that the program that you go into is CAPE accredited, because that's the quality stamp that we have to also meet. And I feel like the compensation issue is real. Having the international perspective myself, all of the College of Educations are almost free in anywhere else in the global programs. If you look at it, I feel like this is a big disservice to even like a low paid profession, which is so critically important, to even charge people to go into teaching profession. So unless we deal with that, we're going to lose our folks to other professions that that are better paid. So that's an overall, I guess, issue with the audience. But yeah, I can only say that in terms of because I don't know the particular programs we're talking about, I cannot speak to the quality, I guess.
Yeah.
I'm really worried about infant toddler higher education. And I'll tell you why. I'll tell you why, because particularly in community-based programs, we're seeing a lot of 4-year-olds and more 3-year-olds go into public education, which means that family childcare and community-based programs are increasingly serving more and more infant toddler. Yet, as we heard from Pam, and as all of you are aware, infant toddler at the high courses at the higher education might be one of our weak spots. What are we going to do about that?
Yeah, and confounding that is there's also one more disconnect, and that is that our early childhood programs at the associate degree level tend to be more organized toward NAEYC accreditation, which really does have a strong emphasis on infant and toddler and the birth to 8 continuum. So those are programs that I work with all across the country, where there is a robust emphasis on infant and toddler that is not there when students articulate. So it's in some ways an unknown advantage of articulating from an associate degree program to a bachelor's degree program. I don't think anyone has ever celebrated that that's one of the benefits of doing that. I think that states are beginning to examine that. And I think one other framework that will help to push for that is, as I mentioned, using a single set of standards and competencies for pre-service, for everything from QRIS through all of the levels of higher education. So and I'm using this term very intentionally, if the professional standards and competencies for early childhood educators are embraced in states, one of the things that means is that you are addressing, as part of that, an emphasis on birth through 8. So I think there are some mechanisms that are recent in their evolution that may help with that. It is a disconnect. It has some mysterious parts and also some promising parts.
Mm-hmm.
Camille, I agree with that, because I know here at our local colleges and universities, the associate degree is under the Department of Human Ecology. It's not under the Department of Ed. So this poor student that's working and took 4 years to get their 2-year associate degree now wants to transfer over to the Department of Ed. And they are now going to do 3.5 years on top of their 2-year degree to get a 4-year degree that they can't make a living wage at. And the sad part is most of our directors would prefer to hire the associate degree, because they have much more hands-on knowledge and experience and are much more ready to enter the field in birth through 5 and be able to be left alone. So I think there's, I agree with you on the teacher standards, and we need to look at that, but only with the caveat, if you include those that are delivering infant and toddler care in those conversations, and they're not being written by people that don't have that experience.
Mhm.
And I would like to add that I think in terms of the policy level, so first of all, some examples, some good news from New Jersey, right? So we have been actually on the same table as teacher educators, states different departments, which, you know, at times it might be hard for different departments to collaborate as well, like the human services and collaborating the education department. So some good news from New Jersey is that Department of Education is exploring an infant toddler teaching certificate, not a credential, but a certificate, which then will sort of like lift up the status of the teachers to as equal as the P33 certificate level, and hopefully the compensation push may come from that. On the institutional level, we need to get that seal of approval from our state, because then we can say to our university, hey, you know what? Department of Education has just, published our new infant and toddler certificate program. We will have the audience to come into our program, so we need to create one. And I think the nice thing that I've been pushing for so long, which we are able to include it in that wording, is that infant and toddler certificates should be at any level. I know we typically think it as an associate level, because that's a lot of where our workforce get into our profession. However, there are people who have been a graduate of a general associate degree in early childhood and want to specialize in infant and toddlers on the bachelor's degree, right? So they're going to be a specialized workforce. Or there are people who have already graduated from bachelor's. So forcing these people to go back and start from even CDAs and associate degrees, just because it's not, to me, it's not fair. And I really want to imagine a workforce where we have leaders specializing on infant and toddlers as leaders and as intermediaries, which we have now, right? Like we have technical assistant specialists, we have infant and toddler specialist networks in different states, in different departments. So I think, that's an area that definitely we need to look at, but not before we view them as equal as our teaching workforce at the, who are teaching at the public school level, because now it's come down to that with universal childcare discussions. So it is time, it's the order of the events. Now we're gonna start discussing the needs and the compensation.
Zeynep, you have brought up a ton of issues and articulated them well together. Unfortunately, we're going to have to wrap up this part, but I'm encouraging each and every one of you to link to the link that you have in the chat and join us so you can interact with our panelists. So we're hearing a lot in all of these areas. Our compensation and financial security is an issue for people seeking the higher education degrees, and once they achieve those degrees, being sure they have that. We didn't talk as much today about anti-bias education, but I think it's come through all of our speakers, the importance of diversity and moving that. The whole issue of apprenticeships, mentorships, student teaching, that all of these things, re-examining them, and it's been a very strong message that we need to look again at our public policies today. So we really invite you to look at the book on which this series is based. You can get a discount by using this code. And I also want to encourage you and welcome you to join our next webinar, The Path Forward, in which the CAYL Institute will join with Leading for Children. Judy Jablon and I are going to present a back to school message for people again it's going to be on Wednesday. So we encourage you to join us Wednesday, September 1st, Judy Jablon and myself giving a back to school message for everyone. We're looking for staff. I think every program in the United States is looking for staff. And so if you know anyone that might be interested in the CAYL Institute, please have them to contact us. We want to thank you very much for learning with the CAYL Institute today. We want to thank the Foundation for Child Development, which funds this webinar series. And we want to encourage you right now to join the link to interact with our panelists. Lots of unanswered questions that came up in the chat, and we'd love to discuss them with you right now. Thank you for joining us. Good night.